Welcome back to Mr. Nightmare Scares You. For those of you discovering our channel tonight, prepare to delve into the darkest side of the American forests where nightmares take shape. And for our loyal subscribers who already know the darkness we bring, turn off the lights, lock the doors and get ready, because tonight's journey will test all your psychological limits. Before we begin the story, let's meet someone who lived through this terrifying experience. Jake, 28, from Seattle, Washington, shared this story that will change the way you see the night. It all started on a trip that was supposed to be just another routine exploration of the Yellowstone wilderness. My cousin Mike and I are experienced hikers, used to spending days isolated from the civilized world. We always prefer the less traveled routes, those that are at least 15 miles away from any tourist campground or paved road. Yellowstone has millions of acres of untouched nature, and we wanted to experience this vastness in a genuine way. Our intention was to do a long hike, set up base camp and return the next day. The weather was brutal. The thermometers read about 20 degrees Fahrenheit when we left our vehicle in the gravel parking lot and entered the dense pine forest. The icy air burned our lungs with every breath, but we were prepared with high-quality thermal equipment. The hike in the first few hours was peaceful, the kind of isolation we were looking for. The snow on the ground was no more than 2 inches deep, enough to make the ground slippery but not impassable. However, as the sun began to set and the temperature dropped drastically to 10 degrees Fahrenheit, the atmosphere of the park changed in a way I had never experienced before. The darkness in Yellowstone is not like the darkness of a city. It is an absolute absence of light, a dense, suffocating darkness that seems to swallow the light of our flashlights before it even reaches 10 feet away. We were on foot, about 8 miles from our car, when the first feeling of dread settled in my chest. It wasn't a rational fear of getting lost, as we had compasses and accurate maps. It was a primal instinct, a biological alarm going off in my mind, warning us that we were no longer alone. I felt an invisible pressure in the air, the absolute certainty that there were eyes fixed on our backs, studying us from the tree line. I tried to ignore the feeling, blaming it on fatigue and the altitude of over 7,000 feet, but the discomfort only grew, turning into a heavy anchor in my stomach. As we made our way along the narrow, frozen dirt path, something profoundly unsettling happened. The forest, which until then had been filled with the usual nocturnal sounds of wildlife, fell completely silent. There was no sound of the wind rustling through the leaves, no distant song of nocturnal birds, nor the rustling of small rodents in the bushes. The silence became so thick that I could hear the blood pulsing in my own ears. Mike, who was walking about 3 feet ahead of me, stopped abruptly. We looked at each other in the dim light of our headlamps, and I saw my own fear reflected in his pale face. Mike isn't the type of man who is easily frightened. He's almost 6 feet 4 inches tall and has dealt with extreme situations in the wild, but the expression in his eyes showed pure instinctive terror. Absolute silence in nature is the worst signal you can receive. It means that the area's natural predators, the animals that live in a constant state of alert, have perceived the presence of something so threatening that the only option for survival is total immobility. We were trapped in this sonic vacuum, completely exposed in the middle of the trail. It was then that an indescribable odor hit us. It was a putrid smell that filled the icy air, a nauseating mixture of old copper, rotting flesh, and wet animal fur. The stench was so intense that my eyes watered and a wave of nausea rose in my throat. We were miles from civilization, with no cell phone signal, surrounded by a labyrinth of trees over 100 feet tall. The feeling of isolation turned into a psychological trap. I knew that whatever was exuding that hideous smell was extremely close to us, hidden behind the deep shadows just a few meters from our position. We started walking again, forcing a pace of about 3 miles an hour. We knew that running through a dark forest would be a fatal mistake, as it would activate the hunting instinct of any predator. We maintained a brisk, controlled pace, our eyes scanning the darkness beyond the beam of our flashlights. The relentless Fahrenheit cold continued to punish our faces, but I was sweating profusely beneath all the layers of clothing. The paranoia became unbearable. With each step on the frozen ground, I felt the air grow thicker, as if we were trespassing on the territory of a demon just waiting for the right moment to punish us. Mike didn't say a word, and I didn't want to break the tense silence either. Any human sound would seem like a profanation in that hostile environment. My mind was trying to rationalize the danger. I thought about the park's numerous warning signs about large predators, but something inside me screamed that this wasn't an ordinary animal. The scent continued to follow us, which meant that the source of that odor was moving alongside us, maintaining a perfect rhythm along the sides of the trail without breaking a single branch. The ability of something to move in absolute darkness, across rugged terrain covered in roots and rocks, hidden under the snow, without making the slightest noise, was something that defied physics and biology. My peripheral vision was beginning to betray me, creating shadows that danced on the edge of the forest, but the constant dread in my chest assured me that the danger wasn't my imagination. We were the prey, and the hunt had already begun. We reached a small plateau where the vegetation parted slightly, revealing the pale moonlight through the heavy clouds. It was then that I saw it, about 50 yards to our right, partially hidden by a huge fallen pine trunk. My heart stopped for a full second. It wasn't a bear. I've seen bears on other trails. I know their silhouette, how they move, and the structure of their bodies. What was watching us was a nightmare incarnate. It stood on two muscular legs that resembled the hind legs of a gigantic wolf, but its build was bipedal. The monster's height was unimaginable, easily exceeding 8 feet, with incredibly broad shoulders that sloped down to a narrow waist. The moonlight shone directly on his face. It was a head that looked like a grotesque mixture of a demonic hunting dog and a wolf, with pointed, alert ears and a long snout. His eyes were the worst part. They didn't gleam with the blinding reflection of an animal struck by light. His eyes radiated a deep amber color, full of wicked intelligence. He was studying us. There was no confusion or fear in his posture, only pure dominance and malice. The creature's bulk, covered in a matted black coat that seemed to absorb the little light in the room, made it clear that any physical resistance on our part would be futile. My legs gave way, and my breath caught in my throat. The icy air around us seemed to freeze even more as that colossal predator stared at us with the confidence of one who had already won before even attacking. The dogman didn't advance toward us. He remained motionless, a statue of pure terror carved into the shadows of the forest, merely observing us with those amber eyes that burned my soul. Physical terror is terrible, but the psychological terror of looking at a being that science claims is impossible and realizing that it is fully aware of its fear is something that destroys your mind. Slowly, without averting his gaze from ours, the monster lowered itself and rested its elongated arms on the snow-covered ground, assuming a four-legged position. Its arms ended in what looked like hands, but with thick, dark claws measuring about 5 inches in length. As Mike and I, driven by blind desperation, began to slowly retreat down the trail, never turning our backs on it, the monster began to move. It didn't rush to attack us immediately. Instead, it began to walk parallel to our trail, venturing deeper into the tree line about 40 yards away. With each step we took toward the distant safety of our car, it took a step deeper into the forest. Utter despair gripped us. We were miles from any rescue, walking in freezing temperatures, being pursued by a giant predator that was clearly toying with us. It wanted us to know that it was in control, that it decided the exact moment our lives would end. Night was just beginning, and true terror was about to unfold beneath those dead trees of Yellowstone. To understand the gravity of our situation, you need to grasp the true scale of Yellowstone. Most people only know the tourist boardwalks and geysers near the main roads, but the park encompasses over 2 million acres of brutal, untamed nature. We were in one of the most remote areas, an unmarked trail deep in the interior that led us through dense valleys and rugged mountains. The trees around us, enormous pines rising over 100 feet high, formed a canopy so thick that it blocked almost all the moonlight. Earlier that day, we had left the small town of West Yellowstone, fueled by hot coffee and a false sense of invincibility. We drove our pickup truck for miles along empty roads before plunging into that vastness. Now that same forest that had seemed a haven of peace in the morning had transformed into a dark prison, where the bars were made of thick logs and the jailer was an abomination that defied all the laws of biology. My cousin Mike has always been the strongest person I've ever known. He weighs about 220 pounds of pure muscle, served in the armed forces, and has vast knowledge of survival in extreme climates. Seeing a man with that background walk with tense shoulders, looking over his shoulder every 10 seconds with wide eyes, destroyed what little sanity I had left. We were walking at a brisk pace, battling the steep terrain and thin air, as we were at an altitude of over 8,000 feet. Every time we tried to quicken our pace, our lungs burned as if we were inhaling ground glass. The thermometer hanging on my backpack read exactly 5 degrees. But the cold wasn't our biggest problem. The problem was the intelligence of that creature. He wasn't simply following us, he was escorting us along a specific path, ensuring we didn't leave his line of sight at any point. The profound darkness toyed with our minds as we continued our agonizing descent down a slope covered in loose rocks and compacted snow. We walked by instinct, keeping our flashlights pointed ahead so we wouldn't trip on roots, but our auditory attention was entirely focused on the forest to our right. The biology of a large animal, easily weighing over 400 pounds, should have made it clumsy in such a dense, debris-filled environment. Yet, the monster moved with demonic fluidity. It didn't step on dead branches, didn't bump into trunks, and didn't pant. The only way we knew it was still there was the nauseating smell the icy wind carried toward us, an acidic mixture of rotten blood and filth that stuck to the back of our throats. Occasionally, the Dogman made a point of reminding us of his superiority. We would hear the heavy sound of his paws hitting the frozen ground for a brief moment, breaking the silent tension, only to stop abruptly afterward. He was practicing calculated psychological terror, playing cat and mouse with two prey he knew to be completely defenseless. Our backpacks, which weighed about 30 pounds each, now felt like they were carrying lead. My muscles screamed with exhaustion. My boots felt like blocks of ice weighing tons, but the constant flow of adrenaline kept me from collapsing. Panic has a peculiar way of distorting time. Each minute seemed to last hours, and the idea that we still had almost 7 miles to go to the parking lot crushed us with an unbearable weight. We couldn't stop to rest. If we stopped, we knew that would be the place of our deaths. The terrain became even more rugged, forcing us to use our hands to climb small rock formations and rotting logs that blocked our path. With each obstacle we faced, we became more vulnerable, exposing our backs to the darkness as we tried to maintain our balance. The forest around us began to seem alive. The shadows cast by our flashlights contorted and took on monstrous shapes that made us freeze in terror with every few steps. My mind, deprived of rest and consumed by absolute fear, began to play visual tricks. I saw the amber gleam of his eyes in every dark bush, imagined his gigantic claws reaching for my neck, with every gust of icy wind on my back. Mike tried to stay calm, turning his face toward me and whispering in a gruff voice that we needed to hold on, that the car wasn't that far away, and that we would survive if we stayed focused. But his voice trembled, betraying his own words. Despair was etched on every line of my cousin's face. We didn't have firearms, an unforgivable mistake that would haunt us for the rest of the night. Carrying bear spray is common in the park, but I knew with absolute certainty that spraying pepper in the face of a creature like that would only enrage it. We were armed only with survival knives with 6-inch blades, which would be like trying to stop a runaway train with a toothpick. The isolation oppressed us, knowing that no one would hear us scream, no matter how loud we did. We were completely alone in the vastness, thrown into a nightmare from which there was no easy escape. As we progressed for the next 2 miles, I noticed a terrifying pattern in the creature's behavior. Every time the trail seemed to widen and slope to the left, toward the distant highway and salvation, the creature would move swiftly through the dense vegetation to block our path. It wouldn't fully reveal itself, but allowed the pale moonlight to reflect off its black fur and imposing posture, forcing us to retreat and choose the opposite path. It was herding us. The Dogman was using its massive size and our instinctive fear to divert us from the main route, guiding us like frightened sheep into an even deeper and more isolated area of Yellowstone. Realizing we were being strategically manipulated by a predator, walking on 2 legs shattered the last barrier of rationality I was trying to maintain. This wasn't an animal acting out of blind hunger. It was a sadistic and calculating intelligence. The temperature dropped even further, and snow began to fall lightly from the dark sky, small white flakes that drastically reduced our visibility to no more than 15 feet. The creature's scent became unbearably strong, indicating that the distance between us had decreased considerably. It was so close I could feel the vibration of its heavy footsteps on the stone ground beneath my boots. My heart pounded so hard against my ribs that I felt sharp pains in my chest. Physical exhaustion was reaching its critical limit, and the biting cold threatened to freeze the tips of our fingers, making it difficult even to firmly grip the straps of our backpacks. We were being herded towards a narrow valley, a natural dead end the creature had carefully chosen to finish its game. The trail we were forced to follow led us to the banks of a deep stream that cut through the middle of a narrow ravine. The ravine walls rose almost vertically to about 30 feet high on each side, covered in smooth rocks and exposed roots, making any attempt at climbing impossible in our exhausted state. The stream water was almost completely frozen, but we knew the ice in the middle wouldn't be thick enough to support the weight of 2 grown men, much less heavy backpacks. We stopped on the frozen gravel banks, staring at the black ice surface, and then at the impenetrable shadows of the forest just behind us. We were trapped. The deadly silence returned with overwhelming force. The snow stopped falling, and the clouds parted slightly, bathing the valley in a ghostly, silvery light. It was then that we saw him step out of the tree line, exactly 20 yards from us. He abandoned the 4-legged stance he used to camouflage himself in the undergrowth and slowly rose to his feet. The monstrosity of his size became even more evident and intimidating. His shoulders blocked the view of the tree trunks behind him, and the dark claws at the tips of his long arms gleamed faintly in the night light. He stopped at the edge of the trail, his canine legs slightly bent, blocking our only way back. His amber eyes focused directly on mine, and a primal warning echoed in my mind. The herding was over. The Dogman had us exactly where he wanted us, and the true phase of his macabre game was about to begin. The relentless pursuit continued, and the monster's tactic of herding us like cattle through the shadows was mentally destroying us. There was no longer room to focus on the biting wind or the 0 degrees Fahrenheit, stinging our skin. The urgency of survival took the place of any other instinct. The nauseating smell that polluted the air suddenly changed. The odor of wet fur mingled with a thick metallic smell of fresh blood. A few meters ahead, the forced trail led us to a small clearing surrounded by gigantic pine trees. The snow beneath our boots, once immaculate, was now soaked and stained with a deep dark red that stretched for dozens of feet. In the center of that carnage lay the carcass of an adult elk. An animal that easily weighed over 1,000 pounds was reduced to a shapeless mass of shattered flesh and bones. The animal's thick ribs had been ripped out with inconceivable violence, and its head was twisted at an impossible angle. Mike stopped abruptly, his breath catching in his throat as the beam of his flashlight illuminated the disaster. He turned to me, his wide eyes reflecting visceral panic. "He didn't eat the meat, Jake. He just tore the animal apart for pure fun," Mike whispered, his voice faltering. I swallowed hard, feeling my stomach churn at the blatant brutality on the ground. "Keep walking. Don't stop looking ahead," I replied in the same gruff tone. The realization that we were being hunted by something capable of tearing apart a massive elk without the slightest effort decimated what little hope we had left. That massacre was left right in our path as a bloody warning. The sight of that massive animal completely destroyed was concrete proof that our 6-inch knives were utterly pathetic tools. We were dealing with a level of brute force that belonged to primordial eras, something that shouldn't exist in the forests of our world. The footprints around the carcass were enormous, deep claw marks embedded in the frozen earth, indicating that the kill had happened only minutes before. Steam still rose from the dismembered moose body. My brain screamed that the predator was watching us uncover its deed, hidden in the deep shadows just a few feet away. Genuine terror gripped my chest, making breathing more difficult than the 8,000-foot altitude. This wasn't the behavior of a wild animal searching for food. It was pure psychological terrorism. The monster had deliberately cornered us so that we would stumble to imminent death. We advanced along the edge of the bloodied clearing with as much caution as our exhausted bodies allowed. It was then that a massive shadow emerged from the line of trees just behind the elk carcass. The Dogman partially revealed itself, bathed in the dim night light, maintaining a distance of about 40 feet. He stood, his monstrous shoulders blocking the view of the forest behind him. The blood of his previous prey still stained his immense claws and elongated snout, dripping slowly onto the white snow. He made no move to move forward. He merely watched us with those amber eyes that gleamed with sadistic malice. His posture radiated arrogance, the absolute certainty that we had no escape. The creature slowly raised one of his colossal arms and scratched the bark of a pine tree beside him, leaving deep furrows in the wood with frightening ease, a visual reminder of how fragile our bodies would be in his hands. We had no choice but to keep retreating, forcing our way down a gravelly slope that led us away from the road and deeper into the isolated heart of Yellowstone. Mike quickened his pace beside me, keeping his knife brandished in a futile attempt at defense. "If it attacks, we aim for the eyes," he said through gritted teeth. I knew it was a desperate strategy, a last-ditch effort to die fighting, as the monster's 8-foot wingspan would prevent us from getting close enough without being gutted in the process. Its presence behind us was an overwhelming pressure, a constant threat that kept us on the brink of a nervous breakdown. The intelligence of that beast was its most terrifying feature. It knew we were tired. It knew the 30-pound backpacks were draining our energy, and it knew exactly where it was leading us. The terrain changed dramatically as we descended the slope. The trees began to space out a little more, but the ground became treacherous, covered in loose stones hidden beneath thin layers of ice. The game of cat and mouse continued, and the certainty that the outcome of this chase would be fatal solidified with each mile we traveled in the wrong direction, far from any trace of civilization. The relentless pursuit pushed us directly into a geographical dead end. The makeshift trail plunged down into a deep ravine where a fast-flowing black stream cut across the path. The width between the two banks must have been at least 20 feet, an insurmountable barrier, considering the violent current rushing beneath the thin layer of surface ice. We stopped abruptly on the frozen gravel banks, the flow of water breaking the tense silence. We were trapped, Looking back, we saw the monster emerge from the shadows and position itself atop the small rise we had just descended. It sat on its muscular hind legs, watching its prey fall into the final trap. Its snout exhaled large clouds of condensed vapor, and its amber eyes fixed on us with diabolical expectation. The icy water meant death by hypothermia in minutes, but the creature blocking our way back meant a far more violent and immediate death. Mike frantically scanned the area with the dim light of his flashlight until the beam illuminated the massive root of a dead pine tree that had collapsed across the creek, forming a makeshift and extremely dangerous bridge. The dark trunk was no more than 3 feet wide and covered in smooth ice. "The fallen tree, Jake. We have to go that way now," Mike shouted softly, gripping my shoulder tightly. We moved sideways along the gravelly banks, never turning our backs on the rise where the Dogman watched us. The monster followed our movement, rising to its hind legs again and walking parallel to us, closing the distance considerably. It was now less than 15 yards from us, and the colossal size of its broad shoulders blocked any view beyond the darkness. The stench of decay mixed with the elk's blood hit us with full force, causing intense nausea and blurring our senses at a critical moment. Every step toward the fallen trunk was a gamble with life. Its plan was perfect: push its prey against a natural obstacle and watch the struggle for survival before delivering the coup de grace. The monster slightly bent its hind legs, tilting its immense trunk forward. The instinctive warning sounded deafening alarms in my mind. If we didn't begin the crossing at that exact millisecond, we wouldn't have the chance to take another step on this earth. Without hesitation, I threw my body onto the slippery log, digging my bare hands into the frozen bark to maintain the minimum necessary balance. The ancient wood threatened to give way under the combined weight of my 200 pounds and the tactical backpack I carried, while the black water of the creek roared a few feet below me. I crawled, forcing my trembling legs to propel me forward, knowing that any false move would result in a fatal fall. I reached the halfway point and glanced nervously over my shoulder. Mike began his crossing, keeping his body low and his attention divided between the log and the bank we had just left. The Dogman didn't try to follow us along the narrow path. Instead, he advanced to the water's edge and adopted an imposing stance, slapping his clawed hands against his muscular chest in a gesture of absolute dominance and fierce agitation. It was in that exact moment of extreme distraction that the inevitable happened. Mike's heavy boot found no grip on the layer of ice accumulated in the middle of the log. He lost his footing and slipped violently, his body plummeting sideways with an oppressive impact against the solid wood. Mike let out a stifled cry of pain as one of his legs dangled dangerously in the air, grazing the surface of the glacial water. He managed to hug the log with both arms at the last second, avoiding a complete fall. The instinct to help my cousin almost made me turn back, but Mike, his face contorted with pain and panic, made an aggressive gesture with his free hand. "Don't go back, keep going, go," he warned, fiercely struggling to pull his own weight back onto the slippery wood. The panic in his voice was the fuel we needed. On the other side of the bank, the monster tilted its animalistic head to the side, observing our despair and near accident with a sick satisfaction, savoring every second of our weakness. The sight of the monster standing on the edge, so close I could see the thick saliva dripping between its long fangs, forced me to ignore the pain in my muscles and quicken my crawl. I needed to reach the firm ground on the other bank to offer some chance of cover for both of us. When my hands finally touched the firm gravel and hard earth of the opposite bank, I rolled my body to the side, drawing my knife from its sheath and turning to face the stream, ready to cover my cousin's rear as he struggled to finish that agonizing crossing. Mike gathered the last vestiges of his strength and, with a desperate push, crawled the final feet off the trunk until he fell panting beside me on the safe bank. We both crawled quickly behind the first cluster of thick trees, trying to conceal our silhouettes in the darkness of that new mountain. Our chests rose and fell violently, our lungs burning with the frigid air. We believed, for a naive and brief second, that the 20-foot width would act as a temporary barrier, giving us at least a few minutes' head start to begin the climb and disappear into the dense forest. But the abomination did not follow the physical rules of our world. As we illuminated the opposite bank, we witnessed something that shattered our sanity forever. The Dogman did not recoil to gain momentum and did not hesitate before the void. The beast simply flexed its colossally developed hind legs and launched itself into the night air. It didn't use the makeshift bridge. The mass of darkness, weighing over 500 pounds, covered the 20 feet of the river's width with absurd and repulsive ease, hovering in the cold air like a gravity-deprived demonic shadow. The thud of its impact hitting the solid ground on our side of the bank sent a violent vibration through the ground. It dug its sharp claws into the soil, landing perfectly steady and without the slightest sign of unsteadiness. "It's gone." "Run! Run now!" I yelled, my voice almost fading from sheer panic. The monster immediately rose, its colossal stature dominating the bank. We turned our backs and began a frantic and chaotic climb up the mountain, entering much denser and more hostile territory. The hunt had just escalated. The stream was no obstacle for it. It was merely a brutal physical test to gauge our exhaustion. The slope we faced now had a steep incline, requiring us to use our legs and hands to climb between the sharp rocks and twisted roots. The backpacks weighed tons on our backs, dragging our center of gravity backward and drastically increasing the risk of tumbling down the hill. Looking back was like signing our own death warrant, and the sound of crumbling gravel below confirmed that the aberration was coming after us, this time directly and aggressively. The game seemed to be coming to an end. We were blindly climbing towards the top of a rock formation, guided solely by the terror of feeling the claws of that creature if we didn't maintain a steady pace. The climb up the mountain was a brutal exercise in instinctive survival that drained every last drop of energy from our bodies. Our hands were scraped and bleeding from trying to grip sharp rocks and frozen roots in the dark, while our nearly 40-pound backpacks pulled us back mercilessly. Every breath in the thin, frigid air burned my lungs, and the fear that the loose gravel would give way beneath my boots kept me in a constant state of panic. We didn't need to look back to know that the Dogman was closing the distance. His presence was a tangible force, an oppressive shadow that seemed to further chill the already chilling ambient temperature, which was around 5 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. He climbed the same rugged slope with morbid ease, without the slightest effort, proving that his biology was perfectly designed to dominate that hostile terrain. Absolute terror propelled us blindly until the mountain's topography underwent a sudden and unforgiving change. The steep slope ended abruptly against an immense solid rock wall that rose like a gigantic tombstone in the middle of the forest. The vertical wall was easily 40 feet high, covered in a thick layer of black ice and slippery moss. There were no footholds, no ropes, and absolutely no way to climb it without the proper equipment. Nature had built the perfect slaughterhouse for our pursuer. We were trapped on a narrow ledge, the mountain blocking our advance and a steep drop behind us, where the monster silently approached. The dim light of our flashlights desperately scanned the rock, searching for a crack, a side trail, or any meager space through which we could escape. Exhaustion reached its critical point. My legs briefly gave way, and I fell to my knees in the hard snow, feeling defeat crush my mind. The isolation of Yellowstone had never been so obvious. There was no rescue, no radio signal, only the cold rock wall and imminent death rising in the shadows behind us. While despair paralyzed my muscles, Mike continued to frantically grope along the base of the stone wall, running his bare hands over the accumulated ice. "Down here, Jake. There's a hole. Come quickly," he murmured, his voice choked with terror. I dragged my exhausted body across the gravel until I reached my cousin's position, There was a deep depression embedded in the base of the rock, a natural fissure that formed a shallow cave approximately 4 feet high and perhaps 8 feet deep. It was a tiny, damp and suffocating space, but it was the only physical barrier we had against the exposed vastness of the forest. Without hesitation, and without considering the risks of being trapped inside, we threw ourselves into the tight opening, crawling over the rough stone until our backs hit the bottom of the inescapable wall. The space was so confusing and confined that our shoulders pressed against the icy sides of the rock, forcing us to keep our knees bent against our chests. The temperature inside seemed to drain the heat directly from our bones. In a swift, rehearsed movement, driven by military instinct, Mike turned off his flashlight and pulled my arm so I would do the same. We were immediately swallowed by a darkness so dense and heavy it seemed to have physical mass. Being in total darkness, deprived of sight in such a hostile environment, was indescribable psychological torture. Our irrational hope was that the monster would pass right by, losing our visual trail in the thick night. The silence inside the crevice was unsettling, filled only by the tense sound of our panting breath, which we tried to hold back at all costs. We became willing prisoners of a stone tomb, awaiting the moment when the entity that dominated that territory decided to claim its prize. The minutes that passed in the darkness seemed like decades, each second wearing away the last layer of sanity that remained in me. The illusion that we were hidden was brutally shattered when the meager nighttime illumination reflecting off the snow outside was completely blocked. A gigantic mass of dark muscle and matted fur covered the entire width of the entrance to our shelter. The temperature dropped even further, and the oxygen seemed to disappear, instantly replaced by that overwhelming odor of decay, fresh blood, and wet animal. My eyes began to burn severely from the acidity of the smell. Dogman found us effortlessly, guided by the terror that seeped through every pore. It was then that he lowered his colossal torso and inserted his grotesque head into the opening of the crevice. The dark snout, adorned with rows of razor-sharp white teeth, was less than 3 feet from my face. The predator's breath was a warm, moist blast that contrasted horribly with the cold rock. But what irreversibly shattered my spirit was the eye contact. Those amber eyes gleamed in the darkness with a sickly intensity, focused directly on our faces. It didn't express the irrational fury of an animal, but rather the calculating malice of a highly intelligent being who perfectly understood the terror it was causing. The monster remained motionless for long seconds, savoring our inability to fight, studying the uncontrollable trembling of our bodies. It tilted its head slightly, its pointed ears brushing against the stone ceiling of the cave, blocking any hope of escape. To stand face to face with a creature over 8 feet tall, whose features indescribably blend wolf and demon, is an experience the human brain simply refuses to process. Despair petrified me. I was fully aware that my life would end there, disemboweled in a filthy hole thousands of miles from home. The moment of sadistic contemplation ended abruptly. The monster raised one of its immense arms, its thick muscles pulsing beneath its dark fur, and forced its way into the rocky crevice. The bizarre hand, ending in thick, dark claws that easily measured 5 inches, scratched the stone walls, scattering sharp splinters upon us. In a swift movement, imbued with overwhelming violence, the creature sank its claws directly into the tactical backpack still strapped to Mike's back. The sound of that super-resistant ballistic nylon being pierced and torn as if it were a thin sheet of paper echoed within the cramped space. The monster didn't try to grab the flesh directly at first. It grabbed the equipment and pulled. The aberration's physical strength was impossible to describe. Mike, a strong man weighing over 220 pounds, was mercilessly dragged across the rock toward the exit, like a mere rag doll. My cousin struggled violently, fighting to secure his boots to the sides of the cave, but the predator pulled with only one arm without showing the slightest effort. "He got me, Jake. He's going to pull me out," Mike screamed, his voice cracking in utter terror as the backpack straps crushed his shoulders. I lunged forward in a suicidal reflex, grabbing Mike's belt with both hands, trying to anchor his weight against the cave wall. The effort was pathetic. The Dogman only pulled with a little more force, and we both slid dangerously toward that gaping maw full of teeth. The fabric of the backpack began to give way, the seams bursting under the brutal tension. The creature growled softly, irritated by the material's resistance, and opened its giant hand to adjust its grip, now seeking Mike's neck or exposed arm. Death was no longer an invisible threat in the forest. It was inside the crevice, touching our skin, ready to dismember us alive in the dark. The distance between the monster's claws and Mike's face was now mere inches. The backpack was almost completely destroyed, held to my cousin by only a worn strap. With his left arm free, Mike aggressively shoved his hand into the side pocket of his winter jacket, his fingers slippery with sweat and blood, desperately groping for his safety gear. In the exact millisecond that the beast lunged its immense jaws to bite his exposed shoulder, Mike pulled out the emergency flare and fired it directly at the abomination's face. The dark crevice was immediately engulfed in an explosion of incandescent red light. The magnesium burned at thousands of degrees Fahrenheit, producing a blinding flash and intense heat that startled even the frigid air of the surroundings. Caught completely off guard by the devastating visual assault, the Dogman recoiled chaotically. He slammed his gigantic head against the upper edge of the rock with extreme force, covering his eyes with his monstrous arms in a rare display of pain and disorientation. The backpack strap finally gave way, freeing Mike from the deadly grip. "Get out of here now," Mike yelled, kicking the remains of the heavy equipment behind him and frantically dragging himself to the edge of the rocky shelter. I followed him instantly, my heart threatening to burst against my ribs. We emerged from the hole, and our vision completely blurred by the red flash, realized that the only clear path was the slope we had just avoided. The creature was beginning to recover from its blindness, moving the enormous black mass toward us again. Without a second thought, we threw ourselves off the cliff edge, hurling our bodies into the void of the night, tumbling down the slope through the soft snow and hidden rocks in a desperate suicidal freefall to escape the sharp claws that tore through the air exactly where we had been half a second before. The chaotic descent down the slope was an absolute nightmare of physical pain and disorientation. We plummeted into a steep, unforgiving abyss, where the soft snow concealed sharp rocks and twisted roots that punished our bodies with every second of the fall. There was no way to stop or control the direction. We were hurled down the mountain by gravity, suffering severe impacts against tree trunks and rocks that threatened to break our bones at any moment. During the uncontrolled freefall, which must have easily covered 50 feet, the only thing that passed through my shocked mind was the image of those colossal claws tearing through the void exactly where our faces had been half a second before. The red flash of the flare remained behind, a fiery shooting star atop the rock face, marking the spot of our near annihilation. The fall ended violently when we hit the bottom of a narrow ravine. We landed heavily on a thick pile of broken branches and accumulated snow, which served as a natural cushion and prevented fatal fractures. I lay on my back, buried almost waist-deep in the icy snow, frantically struggling to draw air back into my battered lungs. The silence that engulfed the valley was so dense it hurt my ears. No sudden movement above, no sound of crumbling gravel. I painfully turned my face to the side and saw Mike a few feet away, huddled under the trunk of a fallen pine tree. We both remained absolutely still, petrified by the possibility that the creature could simply leap from the top of the rock formation and land on us, crushing our exhausted bodies under 500 pounds of pure hatred. The minutes dragged on in silent torture. The monster had been temporarily blinded by magnesium burning at thousands of degrees Fahrenheit, but we knew that the biology of that aberration would recover quickly. Every shadow at the bottom of the ravine seemed to pulse with its presence, but the darkness remained empty. We had escaped immediate death, but now we needed to face the silent enemy that awaited us in the icy vastness of Yellowstone. Surviving the fall was merely the prelude to a new phase of torture. Without our tactical backpacks, which were abandoned and shattered in the rocky crevice, we lost all our vital survival equipment. We had no blankets, supplies, water, and, worst of all, we were completely without light. The merciless cold of dawn enveloped the forest, with temperatures plummeting to around 10 degrees below zero on the Fahrenheit scale. The dampness from sweat and melted snow on our torn clothes quickly turned into a crust of hard ice, draining the last vestiges of body heat we possessed. Getting up from that pile of branches required a willpower I didn't know I had. My muscles were stiff, aching and trembling, and my joints felt filled with ground glass. We drew closer, shoulder to shoulder, and began the agonizing march back. We were at least 4 miles from our vehicle, navigating blindly through extremely rugged terrain. The walk in the deep darkness was a brutal test of psychological endurance. We moved by pure instinct, feeling the unstable ground beneath our boots, frequently stumbling and bracing ourselves against rough tree trunks to avoid falling. The isolation was crushing. The unnatural silence of the forest persisted, a constant reminder that the apex of the food chain still dominated that territory. The absence of attacks brought no comfort. On the contrary, it increased the paranoia. With each dragging step in the hardened snow, I imagined the creature walking parallel to us, hidden in the absolute darkness, its amber eyes focused on the backs of our necks as it followed us back. Extreme exhaustion began to cause minor visual and auditory hallucinations. I saw gigantic shapes moving in the corner of my eye, only to discover they were just branches swaying in the biting wind. Mike held the knife firmly in his hand, walking with the rigid posture of someone expecting a fatal strike at any second. Our survival depended entirely on keeping our blood circulating and not giving in to the lethal temptation to sit down and rest. The transition from dawn to the early morning hours brought a pale grey light that slowly filtered through the dense canopy of the pine trees. After hours of uninterrupted agony, the topography finally began to soften, and the line of trees opened slightly. That's when we saw the gravel parking lot. Our dark pickup truck was parked exactly where we had left it, covered by a light layer of night frost. The sight of that metal vehicle was like finding an oasis in the middle of hell. A final injection of pure adrenaline masked the throbbing pain in my feet, and we both ran awkwardly and desperately toward the car. The forest around the parking lot remained strangely quiet, and the oppressive feeling of being watched still weighed heavily on my shoulders. I reached the driver's side door, my hands so numb from the cold that my fingers felt like inert pieces of wood. The agony of trying to insert the key into the lock with trembling hands lasted seconds that felt like hours, my gaze frantically scanning the line of trees just behind us, waiting to see the colossal 8-foot-tall silhouette burst from the vegetation. When the metal unlocked, we threw ourselves into the cabin, and I clicked the safety pins on all the doors simultaneously. The car's interior was freezing, but the physical barrier of the steel doors provided indescribable psychological relief. I inserted the key into the ignition and turned. The engine coughed, sputtered once, and on the second try, roared to life with a firm, comforting rumble. I turned the heating system to full power, feeling the dry, hot air hit my scraped, bloodied face. Genuine relief hit us so violently that Mike pressed his head against the window and closed his eyes, breathing heavily and steadily. We had done it. We had survived a deadly hunt waged by an abomination that defied nature itself. I shifted into gear and accelerated, sending the tires kicking up gravel behind us as we left that nightmare behind. I drove quickly down the access road, leaving the dense shadows of Yellowstone behind in the rearview mirror. The sun was beginning to rise on the horizon, bathing the snow-capped mountains in a comforting orange light, but my whole body still trembled from the accumulated cold and the extreme shock. We needed to stop at a gas station on the main highway, about 20 miles away, to buy water and try to process what had just happened. When I parked under the bright lights of the station's canopy, Mike got out of the car first, walking with difficulty toward the convenience store. I turned off the engine and got out right after, walking along the front of the vehicle to stretch my aching legs. It was at that exact moment that my eyes caught something on the front of the truck. My blood froze instantly, and the warm air circulating through my body was replaced by a sharp, cutting chill. Deep, fresh marks lay on the massive steel hood and down the sides of the doors. Thick grooves, about 5 inches wide, tearing through the metal and ripping off the original paint, as if the vehicle were made of damp cardboard. The claw marks formed brutal patterns of aggression. I ran my trembling fingers over the deep cuts in the steel. This wasn't done during our desperate escape. The monster didn't catch up with us in the parking lot this morning. The dirt and ice accumulated within the scratches indicated that the attack on the vehicle had happened much earlier. The overwhelming realization of the truth hit my mind like a sledgehammer. The Dogman didn't find us by chance in the middle of that vast forest. He tracked our scent from the moment we parked. He inspected the car, marked his territory by destroying the bodywork, and then deliberately followed us for miles and miles into the forest. That abyssal creature planned the entire hunt from the beginning, leading us precisely into the trap in the mountain. It orchestrated our desperation with a diabolical intelligence that no human being is prepared to face. Years have passed since that ill-fated expedition in Yellowstone, but the awareness of my own fragility has never faded. The trauma lodged itself deep in my mind and Mike's, shaping how we see the world around us. We got rid of all the mountaineering equipment that remained in our homes and completely abandoned the life of outdoor exploration. The American forests hold dark and lethal secrets that society prefers to ignore in the name of tourism and peace of mind. Urban nights don't offer the refuge I expected. Whenever darkness takes over the city and the cold touches my skin through the window, I am immediately transported back to that stone tomb. I still smell the repulsive odor of decay and fresh blood filling my lungs. I still see those amber eyes, full of pure malice, gleaming in the darkness, proving that we are not the absolute masters of this planet. Ancient horrors walk on 2 legs in the deepest parts of the map. Ingenious predators who see humanity only as pawns in a dark and cruel hunting game, where the rules are dictated by blood and absolute terror. If you felt a chill following this journey of pure panic, know that this is just one of the many hidden faces that lurk in the American forests. Danger lurks where the light doesn't reach. Leave your comment below and tell us, what would your reaction be if you encountered something impossible in the darkness? Don't forget to like this post to support our work, share this story with your bravest friends, and subscribe to the channel. Mr. Nightmare Scares. You activate the notification bell so you don't miss any trips into the unknown. Lock your door securely tonight, check your windows, and until our next encounter in the shadows.